The Battle of Hastings, 1066. William the Conqueror claims the English crown for Normandy. What began as a duchy in northwest France is growing into an international empire, with a new king who will try to take Normandy to legendary heights.
Richard the Lionheart was brash, brave, and belligerent, the embodiment of a knight.
Maybe a genius.
But his ambition provokes powerful enemies. For more than a century, the kings of France had been at war with the dukes of Normandy.
This is very difficult for the kings of France, that almost half of France was under the effective control of the King of England.
And a rival is determined to get Normandy back, whatever the cost.
It's very difficult to conquer a place like that quickly, and it particularly is when you're trying to conquer it from dukes who happen to also be kings of England and have massive resources.
Over 15 years of deception, betrayal, and brutal conflict, two kings will play a bloody game of cat and mouse for the future of Western Europe. It's September 1189 in London, and a new King of England is about to be crowned. They call him Richard the Lionheart. He's 32 years old.
Richard was a man who possessed all the characteristics that physically you would look for in a king. He was supposedly around 6'5". He was a gigantic man. He looked elegant. He was the height of chivalry. He was extremely competent militarily, maybe a genius.
Richard was famous in the period for being one of the bravest leaders, particularly in battle, and being an unusually fierce and successful warrior. So he'd earned this name for behaving like a lion in the heart of battle.
His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, is there. She wouldn't have missed this for the world.
She's this remarkable woman. She had 5 sons with her husband Henry and at least 3 daughters, but she definitely does not love all her children the same. Richard seems to have been her favorite.
His younger brother, Jean Santerre, John Lackland to the English, sits in the front row. The family belongs to the House of Plantagenet. They are all descendants of William the Conqueror and of a dynasty which arose nearly 3 centuries earlier with Rollo the Viking, the founder of Normandy. It's a powerful family that owns, in addition to the Kingdom of England, a large part of France, including Normandy. Richard the Lionheart is the new heir to this Plantagenet dynasty. He thus finds himself at the head of a colossal ensemble that stretches from Scotland to the Pyrenees. In England, he is king, but in France, Richard is a duke with an overlord. In the feudal system, he owes obedience, homage, and fidelity to the King of France. In theory, the King of France is all-powerful. His authority, though, is largely symbolic.
In a way, the king is a priest, a direct messenger between God and the people.
This will allow him to be separated from the human condition and to thus inspire a kind of respect.
In fact, in military and economic terms, the King of France is weaker than his vassal. His lands pale in comparison to Richard's enormous realm.
In reality, he's stronger than the King of France because England is a wealthier country than the Ile-de-France, the royal domain.
Richard's overlord, the king who currently reigns over France, is called Philip Augustus. He is 24 years old.
He's very, very clever. Politically very clever. I think he could always see several moves ahead.
So Philip is an interesting counterpart to Richard. They're of roughly similar age, of similar levels of ambition, but also slightly different strengths. He's an excellent ruler, a natural administrator, and wants to centralize his kingdom.
Philip knows that Richard's coronation makes him a formidable rival. He cannot allow another king to challenge his authority. And Richard the Lionheart is a proud man. He'll never let the King of France tell him what to do. A power struggle is underway. England versus France. And up there in the northwest of the Kingdom of France, one territory in particular is at the heart of the conflict, Normandy. The duchy is strategically placed halfway between England and France, and worryingly close to Philip's royal domain.
Because the problem for him is that he has a Duke of Normandy who is de facto independent of his authority, who is only a few hundred kilometers away, a quick forced march away from his own capital. So in that sense, someone like Richard Lionheart can be in Paris in a very short span of time and can threaten Philip very directly, whereas Philip cannot threaten London.
And of course, Normandy has some major assets. With nearly 400 miles of coastline, fertile farmland, and the River Seine running through it, Normandy is the most powerful and the richest duchy in the whole French kingdom. Philip is determined to retake Normandy, whatever the price.
If he can get the English out of Normandy, a couple of things will happen. One, he will add to the security of France, and two, he'll get his hands on all that wealth in Normandy. And he'll get the seaboard to the Channel and the trade of the ports and the fishing and commerce. So it's very much he needs to get this thorn out of his side.
Strategically, if he wanted to make France la douce France again, then it was incredibly difficult if you didn't control the Seine Valley. For an ambitious king of France, this was absolutely the sine qua non.
But as long as Richard the Lionheart remains in charge, Philip will never be able to get Normandy back. This obstacle that stands in his way just has to go. But there'll be no immediate confrontation because both men have a more pressing mission, a 3,000-mile crusade. 10 months after his coronation, Richard the Lionheart arrives in St. John of Acre in modern Israel to launch a military operation to reconquer Jerusalem, which has fallen into the hands of the Muslims. There he meets with Philip Augustus, who has arrived 2 months earlier. Both men responded to the Pope's call, the only power who could unite the two rivals.
And of course, what made them very close in 1189 was that they had all taken the cross. They had all sworn an oath to go on crusade to try to rescue, bring back Jerusalem.
Their first objective is to retake the strongly fortified city of Acre. The city has already been under siege by Christian forces for 2 years, but it refuses to surrender. The Westerners have bombarded the walls, doubled down on their assaults, built mobile assault towers, and even managed to blockade the city by both land and sea, causing famine and epidemics. The fighting has been fierce, but the Crusaders have failed to take the city. Philip Augustus's presence has made no difference. It's Richard who will turn things around. He's obsessed with the technology of war and has brought with him one of its latest and finest examples, the trebuchet, a device that can launch much more destructive projectiles. Day and night, these formidable weapons are unleashed against the walls of the city.
Richard shows up, he gets over his seasickness and launches an attack, and 9 days later the city falls. Just things, this is the way, he had this kind of luck. He'd make his own luck. Wherever he went, things seemed to happen like that. I think both the charisma, this dashing luck, and the way he carried himself. He also had his own navy. He had probably a better army than Philip.
But then there is also the financial capacity. The Plantagenets have not only Norman resources, but also English resources, as well as Poitevin and Angevin resources. War is all about money.
Richard has only been there for 2 months when the city surrenders. The two kings' gamble has paid off, but the Crusade's not over yet. Richard and Philip have vowed not to return home until they've retaken Jerusalem. But on the 22nd of July, 1191, the unthinkable occurs. Philip announces his intention to return to France.
Philip is not at his best in a war situation, you know. He doesn't manage to give the impression of being a great leader in the field in the way that Richard does.
By breaking the holy oath he made to the Pope, Philip loses his honor. But his departure could well change the destiny of Normandy.
He knew that with Richard busy in the Holy Land, that he might have a chance to regain some of his land. But if Richard were in Normandy, Philip wouldn't have been able to beat him.
Naturally, that's what's worrying Richard. So he takes precautions. Before the King of France leaves, he makes him swear on the Gospels that he won't lay a finger on Normandy.
So it was assumed that this would hold Philip, that he would not try to violate this. And Richard was convinced enough to kind of let him go and not return with him.
Philip Augustus swears to leave Normandy alone. But 4 months later, he's back in France. And his oath seems to have been forgotten. From now on, he has just one goal, to retake Normandy, but it's not going to be easy. For nearly a century and a half, the kings of France have been trying to separate it from England and attach it to the crown of France. The Normans are fully prepared to protect themselves. They've already erected an impressive number of fortifications.
There are particularly strong fortifications at strategic points, so along the Seine, for example, where someone like Philip would want to attack the Duchy of Normandy, happen to be among the best fortified.
One region is particularly well fortified, the Vexin. It straddles the two kingdoms, a potentially explosive situation. If the King of France can take the Norman side, he can reach Rouen, the capital of Normandy. So to block any attack at the end of the 11th century, the Normans build an exceptional fortress, the castle of Gisors.
Castles are instrumental parts of warfare, instrumental components in commanding and controlling territory. There is no doubt that there are parts of the Norman frontier in which control of castles are vital. And this is a result of relations between the kings of France and the Dukes of Normandy.
The fortifications at Gisors, crucial for the defense of Normandy, have evolved to hold up against the increasing French menace. Initially, the ground was flat, so they built an imposing artificial hill, over 200 feet in diameter and 50 feet high, and surrounded by a deep ditch. Its embankments are made of earth and stones, with 60,000 tons of wooden trunks to hold them in the form of a stepped pyramid. On the top were an enclosure and a wooden watchtower, but this was replaced by a massive polygonal stone keep and a 30-foot-high wall, topped with a wooden walkway to protect its defenders. Around this core, they built a monumental enclosure, 900 yards long and 30 feet high, protected by 8 towers. It, too, is surrounded by deep ditches. It'd be impossible for Philip Augustus to attack such a fortress head-on. But he is an excellent politician, and he has an ace up his sleeve, John Lackland.
So John is the younger brother of Richard Lionheart. He's the youngest son of Henry II, who is known, as you say, by contemporaries as Lackland, because he had no lands to his name initially when he was so young, because Henry II had so many sons. And he started giving them some of his domains, and by the time John came around, he'd run out of lands to give.
John must have thought, why is my big brother Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Duke of Aquitaine, King of England? Why aren't I Count of Anjou? Why aren't I Duke of Aquitaine? It's not fair.
It's John's dream to take his brother's place. Now that Richard is thousands of miles away, his dream just might come true.
As long as his brother is not around, he can play an important role and govern a good part of the Plantagenet territories, theoretically on behalf of his brother.
Well, for a jealous younger brother, this was a wonderful opportunity. But of course, he did not have much in way of castles and men and money himself. He needed a friend, a powerful friend, a good friend to help him achieve his ambition. Oh, Philip, yes. And so he make an alliance.
But Philip knows John Lackland well. He'll be easy to manipulate.
Philip realizes this man is out of his depth. If I can make him king, he will owe me. Plus, I can probably arrange for him to be king on my terms. And he's not going to be capable of keeping his French lands the way Richard certainly can.
The alliance is sealed. With the Duke of Normandy's brother at his side, the King of France can attack the duchy with much more force. In April 1193, he arrives with his army at Gisors, determined to conquer the castle.
Gisors Castle is being commanded by a personal friend of Richard. In fact, Richard has sent this man named Gilbert to defend this castle, knowing how important this is. His one job is to come defend this castle.
But this Norman lord, Gilbert de Vascueil, disobeys Richard's orders. He decides simply to surrender and to hand the castle over to the King of France.
When the French army arrived, he might have feared a siege. A siege can be daunting, especially if the royal army was large, surely much larger than the troops he had. But Philip probably also managed to buy him with gifts and promises.
These men may well feel like Normans, but what does it mean to be a Norman? It means to belong to this territory that is Normandy, and thus to be loyal to the Duke of Normandy. But given that it's actually a space that is claimed by the King of France, they can also recognize that it's legitimate for the King of France to have these fortresses, especially since the King of France is the rightful sovereign of the Duke of Normandy.
So these kinds of acts of betrayal may seem shocking to us, but they're quite common in medieval politics and warfare, in the sense that people almost always have some loyalties and some friends on both sides, particularly of these long-standing feuds and conflicts.
Richard's absence is a boon for the King of France. It makes him even more feared.
Some castles some are surrendered because there is a lack of leadership, there's confusion, and Philip is present in a way that Richard is not. So his presence is fundamental. Philip is not a great warrior. He's not Richard. But he's very, very clever. And he knows that campaigns can be won and lost in the political theatre as much as in the battlefield.
Philip is now master of the Vexin. His dream of reconquering Normandy is within reach. Nothing can stop him now. Least of all, his arch-rival, Richard, given the situation in which he now finds himself. For the Lionheart is in jail.
On the way back from the crusade, he's captured by the Duke of Austria, whom apparently he had insulted during the crusade.
A minor noble by the name of Leopold of Austria wanted to put his banner up with Philip Augustus and Richard. He wanted to be treated as the equal of these two. And this annoyed Richard because Leopold was a minor noble. And so Richard ripped his banner and threw it on the ground, which is a very insulting thing to do.
After failing to take Jerusalem, Richard leaves the Holy Land for England. He travels by the Adriatic Sea to Venice in Italy, and then he goes overland across the Alps and therefore through Austria. Even though he's traveling in disguise, he's recognized by some of Leopold's men.
The Duke of Austria, takes advantage of finding Richard going through his land and captures him.
Public enemy number one, arrested. The news of Richard's captivity is a total bombshell. It is beyond Philip's wildest dreams. He no longer has to hide the hatred he's been nurturing since the crusade began. He rapidly writes a letter to the Duke of Austria. His intentions are clear. By all the means at our disposal, we pray to you from the bottom of our hearts, by the mercy of God, to keep Richard under good guard and not to release him under any pretext.
He knows that Richard is very powerful, and that if he comes back, he may not only easily regain the fortresses of Vexin, but may also decide to take his revenge and go a bit further. The fact is that Philip has, in a way, broken their non-aggression pact.
And that's why he encourages the Duke of Austria to hold on to Richard longer, so that he can then use this time to do more damage, to get his fingers in the pie in Normandy.
His operation to reconquer Normandy can continue. His next step is to take Rouen. Rouen, located halfway between Paris and the English Channel, is a port city that sits on the banks of the Seine. With an area of 200 acres and with 40,000 inhabitants, Rouen is one of the largest cities in France, perhaps even the largest. Capital of Normandy since the Vikings conquered the duchy almost 3 centuries ago, it is the seat of power for the Duke of Normandy himself, who lives here in the palace.
I don't think Normandy would exist without Rouen. It's similar to, say, Paris, to France. It's the beating heart of the dukedom. It's the center of its history.
It's a true intellectual and artistic center, thanks to its cathedral. It's also one of the Plantagenet state's most essential centers of commerce. Fish, wine, and salt all pass through Rouen between England and France. There's a flourishing textile industry.
They make Rouen sheets, which are sold a lot abroad too. They are an important export product. So the bourgeois have become rich thanks to the sheet trade. And they all have their workers, the washers, the weavers, etc. And these are the people who will form the militia of Rouen. And it has to be a sizable militia to defend such a large city.
Rouen is very strongly fortified. A first rampart encircles its historic center. The rest of the city is protected by a huge and high stone wall, reinforced by at least 20 defensive gates. Finally, a stone bridge blocks any enemies coming in along the Seine. A tower built on an islet defends the bridge. But here in this year of 1193, the King of France isn't worried. He expects the city will capitulate as easily as Gisors did. Except that this time, there's a real leader at its head. Robert, Earl of Leicester.
He's a very effective military governor, and he injects this vigor into the defenses. He makes these daily routes around the walls. He is clearly a competent military man, the way he's arranging things. He has this kind of saucy response when Philip asks to come in and hear discuss terms of surrender. The Earl of Leicester says, sure, you can come in by yourself anytime you want. It's a none too subtle threat to kill him if he comes in. And I think the people of Rouen appreciate this. Finally, someone showing some spine and some backbone. And I think this kind of leadership is contagious.
The whole city takes up arms. Philip Augustus shall not pass.
The people of Rouen have no desire to live under the rule of the King of France. They will all mobilize against what they see as an invasion. In addition, they know very well that if Philip Augustus enters Rouen, it means that he takes possession of the capital of the duchy, and thus symbolically of the duchy itself.
Philip has come for a quick victory, not a serious siege. So he withdraws. In the Middle Ages, that's just how siege warfare goes.
Most of the conflicts between Philip and the Plantagenet rulers take this kind of form of invading, besieging for a while, giving up on a siege, or taking a castle, but then later ceding it back in negotiations. If you think you have a much stronger hand, you press it. But if things are starting to get drag on too long, get too dangerous, you then potentially retreat while securing some of the gains you've made.
For now, Philip can be patient, but only as long as Richard the Lionheart remains in prison. A huge ransom is being demanded for his release.
That ransom payment is absolutely astronomical. He asks for 100,000 pounds of silver, something around, I don't know, $2 billion in today's currency. It was roughly, to put it in perspective, 3 times the annual income of England. So there's very little chance that this sum can be raised quickly.
Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, is determined to find the money. She sets up an enormous crowdfunding campaign. The biggest contributions come from England and Normandy.
There's a special tax. She collects wool. She goes around to different churches and collects their plate, anything valuable they have. People contribute to get Richard out of prison. And remarkably, in about 6 months, she raises this astronomical sum and then transports it herself to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor to release her son.
In France, time is running out. John Lackland lives in fear of his brother's return. He needs the protection of Philip Augustus, so he agrees to sign a treaty. He cedes the eastern part of Normandy, east of the Seine, to the King of France, with the exception of Rouen. He also abandons many territories in the west. He's handing Philip even more than the French king expected. The two of them both fear the Lionheart's eventual release so much that they effectively up the ransom.
Richard was going to be released in January 1194, and then a letter reached, or envoys came to the emperor, saying that if you keep Richard in prison for an unlimited period, John and Philip will combine to pay you so many £1,000 every month. And he postponed the release in order to extract more money and more from Richard.
But through perseverance, political pressure, and compromise, Eleanor's campaign achieves its goals. The lion will soon be freed from his cage. In May 1194, after being away for 3.5 years, Richard the Lionheart finally returns to Normandy.
Richard is welcomed very warmly. He was a very popular monarch for the most part. He obviously had his enemies, but for the most part, people are very happy to have him back, and particularly so because what the magnates of the kingdom don't want is a power vacuum.
Now Richard has to deal with the 2 men who betrayed him. His younger brother comes clean about it all and begs for forgiveness.
When John rushed to Richard and knelt before him, begging for forgiveness, Richard said, "Don't worry, John, You have been led astray. You are just a child.
He has little choice but to at least nominally accept and forgive. So he almost certainly is not saying, we're going to play happy families, and you're my new best friend. But what he is doing is pragmatically acknowledging that John is submitting to him, and John is doing what's pragmatic for him as well. Richard's returned. He has little other choice.
This is the business of politics. Better to have John on side than a permanent enemy. I think that was important. It was a good decision.
A very different fate awaits the King of France. To regain his honor and his lands, Richard will wage a ruthless war against his enemy.
Richard does what he does best. He goes out campaigning and fights, and he forms alliances as well, which help. But by this stage, he retakes most of the land he's lost in the interim period.
But the fortress of Gisors in the Vexin remains in the hands of the King of France, which means Rouen is still exposed. Richard must construct fresh defenses for his capital. He will build a castle, the likes of which has never been seen. In the heart of Normandy, halfway between Paris and Rouen, there stands above the Seine Richard the Lionheart's most formidable weapon, Château Gaillard.
This was a magnificent fortress built like a stake in the middle of that borderland, as I am going to hold this land, by Richard. And so it was widely viewed as impregnable, like most of the things Richard did. This is a magnificent fortification. It was just on a grand scale, unlike any other fortress he had ever built.
It's a show of power by Richard. It's obviously there to defend Normandy, but it's also an offensive base from which Richard can launch attacks into France. So it's a warning to France that I'm prepared to invade you at any time from here.
A small town's worth of craftsmen and workers is needed to build the fortress. 6,000 of them work day and night, stonemasons, carpenters, but also engineers using the most modern construction technologies of the time. This revolutionary masterpiece of defense is built in record time, less than 2 years. A testimony to the power of the Duke of Normandy.
He's investing huge sums of money in building Château Gaillard, his prize castle. He's spending, on an annual basis, 2 to 3 times as much on this one castle as on all of his castles in England. And Richard famously said of the castle that its walls would hold even if they were made of butter.
The structure, 650 feet long, 250 feet wide, and over 300 feet high, is designed to be able to withstand any assault and resist any invader for many months. Surrounded by an impressive 40-foot deep ditch, and with its 3 enclosures, one inside the other, it's like a colossal nest of Russian dolls, and each of them is full of obstacles, ditches, hoardings, arrow slits. The walls, 13 feet thick, can withstand the ballistic impact of the era's increasingly powerful artilleries.
You have to break through various sectors one at a time to get to the keep, the donjon, if you want to take the castle. And it's very elaborately protected. And because it's so well designed, you only need a small amount of men to garrison it, to man the walls.
The fortress once again puts Richard in a position to directly threaten France. The balance of power has shifted back to Normandy, but an unexpected event is about to change everything. In the spring of 1199, having gone to suppress a revolt in one of his fortresses, Richard the Lionheart is hit in the shoulder by a crossbow. Gangrene sets in. A few days later, the Duke of Normandy, the King of England, dies in his mother Eleanor's arms. His reign has lasted for 10 years.
It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for Richard, and it's a tragedy for the Angevin Empire. And it's a godsend for Philip. He may not have wished it, Philip, but it was the best thing that happened to him up at that moment.
He must be very relieved because Richard has been gaining on him. With Richard in control, I don't think that Philip saw that he would make many more gains in Normandy.
Philip Augustus now faces a very different adversary. Richard had no heir, so now the Plantagenet territories all pass into the hands of his younger brother, John Lackland.
No one would have chosen him if he were not the son, the only surviving son of Henry II. I mean, he was clearly a useless, deceitful, nasty piece of work. But the hereditary system of government, the fact that it was a dynastic system, it could only be a son or a brother or a nephew who could rule. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, it was certainly very bad for the Plantagenet family that John took over.
With his detestable reputation and his history of political mistakes, the reign of John Lackland begins badly.
He manages to lose the support and the loyalty of large parts of his own court, and particularly of those crucial continental domains. Is this the kind of man you want ruling you? Is this the kind of man you can trust to keep his promises? So suddenly large numbers of previous Plantagenet supporters in Normandy, in Anjou, in Gascony, start turning sides and start offering Philip support. And it's using this that Philip is then able to launch a highly successful campaign.
But there's an obstacle, the fortress of Chateau Gaillard.
Chateau Gaillard is the key to Normandy, and that until you take it, you won't get Normandy.
It's impossible to attack head-on.
Philip is not the type of king or general to lead from the front. What he was a master at is siege warfare. This was his great military strength, so he would take very powerful places.
In 12,003, the siege of Chateau Gaillard begins. It will last for 7 months. It's one of the longest and most tragic sieges of the Middle Ages. The King of France's plan is to impose a total blockade on the Norman garrison. Around the fortress, he builds 2 parallel lines of defense. They're composed of palisades, ditches, and about 15 wooden towers. The first line prevents any of the besieged from escaping. The second blocks any reinforcements from outside. No provisions can get through. The French camp settles into this impenetrable shelter. They start building sophisticated siege weapons, including mobile wooden towers to protect the attackers during approach maneuvers.
The whole siege operation is enormous. The engineering and strategy involved was very, very intense.
Archers play a key role throughout the siege. In tight formation, they target an area, hoping to set fire to the enemy camp, and they shoot at a rate of about 10 arrows per minute, night and day. But the Normans are quite capable of defending themselves. From atop their fortress, they bombard the French with catapults. These are capable of hurling 20-pound balls over 50 yards. The fighting rages on for months. The fortress sends for aid from King John Lackland. In vain. His reply merely says, in effect, "Thank you for all you have done. Hold on for as long as possible."
Jean should have come to Normandy himself with an army. He might have succeeded in stopping the siege of Chateau Gaillard. The issue had been resolved in his favor, but he did nothing.
He's gone back to England, and one chronicler complains he's spending time having too many baths or spending too much time with his young wife, you know, that he's not there in the field defending his inheritance.
But the Normans continued to protect their fortress fiercely. After 7 months of siege, the King of France loses patience. He changes his tactics. He launches a direct attack. The French manage to approach the ramparts. They dig into the rock on which the big tower of the first enclosure sits. They support it all with wooden beams and place a mixture of hay, straw, and oil inside. Then light it on fire. The construction collapses and the attackers rush into the breach. The ensuing man-to-man combat sends the Normans fleeing back to their second enclosure. There they are safe. At this point, the Russian doll construction system proves its worth. Until the French spot a weak point along the southern curtain wall. A chapel added by John Lackland after the death of his brother. To let the light in, he put in a row of 10-foot-high windows. A big mistake, and a stroke of luck for the French.
A man called Boggis, which means the snub-nosed, I think, manages to climb in through a window. He notices a window into a chapel, and they do manage to scramble in, and they set fire to it, and the garrison panics.
The Normans crowd into the dungeon, their final refuge, as the French army pours into the second enclosure. Philip Augustus now controls 2/3 of Chateau Gaillard. All that's left now is the last enclosure. The French dig a tunnel to weaken their bases and bomb the walls. Their third cannonball brings down a whole section of the ramparts. No amount of hand-to-hand combat can stop the French now. On the 6th of March, 1204, the entire Norman garrison is taken prisoner. Philip Augustus has achieved the impossible.
It was a huge symbol, and so when it goes, that is the end.
So once somewhere like Chateau Gaillard falls, the political and military momentum is all with the French king. And people see this, and people see that Philip is going to win eventually, so there's no point fighting him. John is not going to defend us, so let's just accept the new reality and get it over with as quickly as possible.
In just 4 months, without fighting a single battle, the King of France manages to become master of all Normandy. All that's left now is to conquer the capital. But Rouen has already repelled him several times. The city still presents quite a challenge. It is fully fortified and is defended by experienced soldiers who fled the advancing French conquest. But this time, they lacked the will to fight.
Philip Augustus went to Rouen, and when he arrived in Rouen, practically all Normandy was conquered. So the Rouennese, as you can see, had nothing left to do but surrender. So he negotiated with them. It was quite clever. He negotiated. He gave them some extra time. It was early June. He gave them until June the 30th to surrender. They were waiting for help. They really needed John to come, but they realized he wouldn't come. So they didn't even wait until June the 30th. They capitulated on the 24th of June, 1204.
Philip Augustus's dream is now a reality. He's regained control of Normandy. The duchy has been the heart of the kings of England's political power. Now it returns to the French crown.
So it's a very sudden turning point in the history of one French province, the province of Normandy, which had its own special history, its own special sense of its own identity. And then that is not gradually eaten away, so much as suddenly broken. Broken because of the sheer incompetence of the King John and the ruthless political skill of King Philip of France.
John Lackland has indeed lost Normandy. He was simply unable to defend one of the most beautiful jewels in his crown. Very soon, Maine, Anjou, Touraine, and Poitou will also fall. All he'll have left is Aquitaine. It's the end of the Plantagenet Empire.
When confronted with these sorts of things, John loses his nerve and seems to just look on with dismay from England. And things just get worse and worse and worse as he does so. Because without the king there in person, there's nothing to steady the ship.
The French conquest marks the end of the entire dynasty of the Northmen, which had begun 3 centuries earlier with the Viking invasion. Both men and women have fought, often to the death, to protect Normandy.
The Normans had quite a strong sense of themselves as being great warriors, as being very successful. And of course, suddenly they don't win. It must have shattered their sense of what it was to be Norman. And gradually they have to develop a place for themselves within the French kingdom.
After so many years of conflict, Normandy finally knows peace. But there's still John Lackland to deal with. This is one tenacious villain. He clings like a tick to the beast. He's still King of England, but he wants Normandy back too, and all the other Plantagenet territories that Philip Augustus has taken.
It's a terrible shame on him that he had lost so much, so he does try again.
10 years after Normandy is annexed, John Lackland forms an alliance with France's rivals in continental Europe and goes to war against Philip. On the 27th of July, 1214, the two sides fight the Battle of Bouvines in the north of France. They want to kill the King of France and snatch his kingdom.
Philip is heavily outnumbered, and the imperial armies are confident of victory. But what really turns the tide in Philip's part, and in these past 10 years, Philip also has grown. He's much more at home on the battlefield than he was, say, when he was on the crusade. And his army is much better organized.
The French win a resounding victory. John Lackland is humiliated. He will never return to France. A triumphant Philip Augustus heralds the beginning of national unity. Some even consider 1214 as the date of birth of the French nation.
He can argue that we are all French. We're not just a loose connection of people. We are united by a similar language and a similar monarch, a similar system. And so I think it's fair to say that Philip, in these important ways, creates France. I really don't think France becomes France without Philip.
As for Normandy, it will continue through the following centuries to occupy an important place in the history of France. Even today, the land in the north still echoes with the legendary exploits of the Norman warriors and their turbulent destinies.